Welcome to the Cultivating Civility podcast. I'm your host, Diane Kalen-Sukra, author of Save Your City and founder of Kalen Academy. Together, we'll explore ways to tackle toxic behavior in public spaces and foster a culture of respect and civility in our communities. In short, impactful episodes of about 15 minutes or less, you'll hear insightful conversations with civic leaders and sages, along with special civility dispatches that offer wisdom and practical strategies for renewing civic culture. Let's dive in. In today's episode, I'm honored to be joined by Mayor Ron Nirenberg, a leader who has made compassion the cornerstone of his governance. As the mayor of San Antonio, Texas, since 2017, he's championed policies that prioritize people, bridge divides, and cultivate a civic culture rooted in compassionate action. At a time when political discourse is often polarized and civic spaces are increasingly fraught with division, Mayor Nirenberg offers a powerful counterexample, demonstrating how compassion can be operationalized in governance, from equity-based budgeting to citywide compassion training. In this conversation, we'll dive into the why behind his commitment to compassionate leadership, how San Antonio became a compassionate city, and what civic leaders and engaged citizens can learn from his approach. If you've ever wondered whether compassion and governance can truly go hand in hand, or how to create lasting cultural change in your own community, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join the Cultivating Civility Masterclass, a one-of-a-kind, on-demand, self-paced, online program designed for busy civic leaders, just 4 to 5 hours to complete. Inside, you'll gain a step-by-step roadmap to renewing civic culture, a civic culture assessment tool, exclusive insights from over a dozen visionary civic leaders worldwide, a masterclass certificate, and the Cultivating Civility Leader Golden Seal, and so much more. Enroll today at kalenacademy.com/civility masterclass. Hello, Mayor Nirenberg.
Hi, Diane. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Really honored to have you here today. I know there's a lot of anticipation for your participation here. Your very first act in office in 2017 was to sign this resolution affirming San Antonio as a compassionate city, establishing compassion as the core value of your administration's policy making. And when you last joined us at Kalen Academy, you described this compassionate disposition as second nature and as central to who we are as human beings. And yet today, amid even further divided and polarized communities and fractured human relations and all the rising toxicity that we see in the public square, it's still not the political norm to prioritize people or compassionate relations or the building of a culture of shared understanding and mutual support that is really so central to your leadership. So today, seeking ways to cultivate civility, and that is true civility, not that sort of artificial manners and politeness alone that sometimes people associate it with, but really the traditional sense of conduct becoming of a citizen in a democracy, that where we recognize each other like our inherent and equal worth and dignity, and committing us to treat each other as we wish to be treated, which again requires empathy and compassion, that core value that you've identified as so central to your leadership. But before we get into some of the ways that you and your administration have actually walked the walk over your repeated re-elections, can you please share the why, the personal and the political thinking that has so convicted you on the centrality of prioritizing compassion in both civic leadership and in community building?
Sure. Thank you, Diane. And I share all of this work and the priorities that we've placed on investing in people and making compassion the foundational principle of policymaking in San Antonio, which I believe it to be for all public policy. I share that with a great team and a great community, and I think it's really at the heart of what we try to do as communities. We just need to first recognize it. So that's why I chose to put that on the top of our agenda my first day in office, is because I wanted to make sure that people understood that we were going to recognize and uplift compassion as the foundational principle for all of the work that we do on behalf of the public. I guess where that started from is really early on. I was raised by a mother who made sure that I exhibited the kind of care for my brother and sister and for the world around me that we identify as compassionate acts. Later on, I've understood compassion through the work of the International Charter for Compassion, which I got introduced to even before I was in elected office. As I worked my way through my tenure as a city council member and now as mayor, I wanted to make sure that remained a identified foundation of all the work that we continue to do. Now, I'll tell you that as my work in the compassion space has continued, we have really focused in on the fact that compassion is fundamental to all of us. It's part of the human DNA. It's what makes us human. We need to not only recognize that, but we need to practice it. Compassion is also something that requires practice and it takes training. And so we have made a deliberate effort to take compassion training out into our community. And now through additional work, taking that to my peers and the rest of the country through Compassionate USA. So it was early on a foundation and it continues to be, and that's a very intentional act.
I know maybe you might tell us a little bit more about how you operationalize that, but definitely a feature of your compassion work is bridging divides and building bonds from the political to the religious to the personal. Much of that work is actually coordinated right out of City Hall as part of what is called the Department of Human Services, namely the faith-based initiative, which includes Compassionate San Antonio. Can you share a little bit about the genesis and operations of this initiative?
Compassion San Antonio was an offshoot of the initial resolution and the Charter for Compassion that we signed in the city of San Antonio. We implement the ideas that were brought forth through the resolution, highlighting and uplifting compassion when it takes place in our communities, making sure that we're operationalizing compassion as a principle for public policymaking in our own city departments, and then taking compassion training out into the community. We do that through an actual liaison within our city. Reverend Ann Helmke, who's made this her life work, has been part of our city and really has helped to spread these ideas far beyond where we originally were envisioning. And I would say we're having a major impact in the city of San Antonio and far beyond that. I'll also share with you the fact that when we talk about compassion, we need to distinguish it from empathy. And here's why I think it's important for public policy. We all aspire to have empathy. We think we all should be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand what they're going through in order to deal with the issues in the public arena. Compassion is different than that. Compassion is taking action to address those things. Compassion is what we do to ease someone else's suffering. And by the nature of the work that we do in the public space and city government, that's why we allocate resources to address infrastructure needs. That's why we address social services needs through our human services department. That's why we do what we do. And so to identify compassion and to train our city departments on it was really to double down on that notion and make sure that we always had a touchstone for the work that we're doing and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Going beyond that, it can be understood as the purpose for why we do any work in the public space, in a public-facing organization. And so we've been very delighted that all of our organizations, or 100% of our higher education institutions, businesses, nonprofits, have all started to work through this Compassion Institute, where we, again, identify compassion and train people on how to operationalize it within their own personal and professional lives.
It's interesting because cultural transformation is difficult at best because it's such a long-term, and oftentimes short-termism seems to be one of the greatest challenges we have as a civilization. And especially elected officials, you're talking about term after term. So it's hard to see long-term, and cultural change takes time. And I've seen you from the early days push back against people who are saying, I want an immediate ROI on that investment, and you're reminding people that human beings and that we can transform culture. Like I heard you say it, through the behaviors that we champion, the ones that we tolerate, the ones that we don't tolerate. And some of the most powerful work that it seems that you and your team have been doing is collating and seeing the good, the compassionate acts within community and celebrating and valuing them. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about how you create that cultural energy around compassion.
Yeah, I will say that push back on the idea that by signing this and passing this resolution, all of a sudden became a compassionate community. San Antonio was a compassionate community long before that. The cities that are probably listening are compassionate cities, people who exhibit the real human to human connection and working with one another, and treating people the way they want to be treated and not treating people the way they don't want to be treated. We just simply have to identify it and uplift it and underscore it as the value that we aspire to. We've done a number of things. I would say one of the most impactful things we did from the very start was to make equity a framework for how we allocated resources. Every city in this country, and especially so in San Antonio, have populations that are left behind. In order for us to deliver quality, effective public policy, we have to also recognize the failings of what we've done before. Through an equity lens, we budget our resources to make sure that we're investing in parts of town that have been underinvested in for years, making sure that we have opportunities for economic mobility in places that have been struggling in poverty. A simple example is one part of town that has been predominantly lower income census tracts is also the same part of town that has had failing infrastructure because of the fact that it floods in that area. And so we decided it's not okay to budget just an equal slice of the pie to that area and expect things to get better and for people to have quality services and streets. And so we started allocating additional with the support of the city council, who recognizes that equity is an important budgeting principle. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with city policy that, again, identifies and stands on.
There was a really interesting initiative recently that also makes this distinction between empathy and compassion. That's around addressing economic inequality. That's not just about saying, oh, that's too bad, you're struggling to find work. And you had this program called Ready to Work program, which actually empowered people, and to me really exemplifies that compassionate core. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that program.
Sure. And again, to your point about it takes time, a lot of these inequities, the fact that people, depending on what zip code they live in, have a different life expectancy, have different opportunities in life, some of them due to redlining policies of the past. These things are the broken foundations we've built our nation on, our cities on, and these are the things that at their core need to be fixed for us to address equity issues and be a compassionate society. So it takes time to undo those things. We can't simply undo all of the disinvestment over generations in one budget year or two budget years or one mayoral term. We have to be committed to it over the long run. The San Antonio Ready to Work program is a great example of that. I brought to our community a sales tax initiative to reallocate existing sales tax to go towards job training and placement for folks who have been struggling and who have been underemployed and locked in cycles of generational poverty because they have to work 3 or 4 jobs just to put food on the table. And therefore, their kids have statistically lower educational outcomes. And therefore, they and their children and grandchildren are stuck in more cycles of poverty. And that just continues and exponentially grows. We decided through a vote of the public that we were going to change those cycles, reverse those cycles. So we're providing for job training and placement and wraparound services to get people into training for new careers that pay well, for jobs that are available that our employers say we need these kinds of skilled employers, and we're going to hire straight out of your workforce program. We've had this program operational now for about a year and a half. We've had over 13,000 people apply. The vast majority are communities of color, lower income, and the average participant is a woman of color who's living below the poverty line, making less than $14,000 a year and trying to raise children. When she graduates from this program and is placed in a job, she's making $44,000 a year and therefore needs only a single job, and her children are in a much better position then to get the assistance they need and continue to pursue their own education, and therefore the cycle turns around. We've had almost 2,000 people complete the job, over 1,000 already placed in jobs. They're going into healthcare careers, manufacturing careers. They're going into jobs that pay well and that employers need. And so it's a win for the entire community. That's the Ready to Work program. I can give you more examples about how we're providing education opportunities for people that in our previous iteration of public policy simply had too many barriers to even apply. We're breaking down those barriers. That's what we mean by equity. And equity is at its core a compassion principle, a principle based on compassion and compassionate policy.
In so many ways, foundational to democracy. What about that one value about equality of opportunity and fair opportunity for all in a free nation? And indeed, that principle that, yeah, the ideal society is a just society. When these kind of systemic injustices have got to be addressed if we're going to be a caring society.
Yeah. Oh, and I see DEI policies attacked in our current political atmosphere, especially here in Texas. And people like to equate equity with equal outcomes. And that is not what we mean. Equity is equal opportunity. Equity is a level playing field. Equity is recognizing the fact that not everybody has the privilege to start at the starting line, sometimes way, way far in the back. And if we continue to say that just by giving everyone an equal share all the time, the folks that have been left behind for generations are going to all of a sudden catch up, that is ignorant to the reality. So right. I am a strong supporter of the DEI initiatives that we've had. I am a vocal proponent of making sure that we recognize our own history, and that in order for us to achieve a just society, as you said, we need to make sure that equal opportunity are not just words, but something that we actually push towards with public policy.
It's interesting because these were not polarized thoughts that you're suggesting, but there has been a kind of cultural shift, this supposed survival of the fittest that, again, is anti-democratic in so many ways. And compassion is actually a central democratic value. In fact, I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King saying that the greatest problem in history is this fact that we separated love and compassion from power. And imagine that they're actually polar opposites when if you have power without love, that's just reckless and abusive. And you show great wisdom. The idea that you can't just legislate civility, you can't just legislate compassion, but that it requires a long-term implementation and living out, which you and your administration have done. And I commend your example. I know there's so many people who take inspiration from it. And I do think that there is a new, deeper understanding of civic leadership that takes into account people first and reminds ourselves that it's a human building project and it's not just about numbers. And so I wanted to thank you so much for embodying that all these years and so resiliently.
Thank you very much. And this is work that we take inspiration from each other. At the end of the day, all I've heard, whether it's campaign speak or not, every public official strives to make sure that the work they do leaves a quality of life for their constituents. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that not everyone is in the same circumstance, and that there are people in our communities that are suffering. And public policy is meant to improve the lives of all of us. Thank you so much for the work that you all are doing to turn the tide, because I do believe that we can change the culture in the right direction, because we've seen it go in the wrong direction in our political discourse over the last several years. It is possible to change it in the other way as well.
Thank you, Mayor Nirenberg. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Diane.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Cultivating Civility podcast. Please feel free to share and subscribe. To take it one step further, you're invited to enroll in the Cultivating Civility Masterclass at kalenacademy.com/civility masterclass. Until next time, let's keep cultivating civility one conversation at a time.